So what does society think about Dr. Martin Luther King now? There are some that would argue that Dr. King did not do enough and that he was too peaceful. Some say that student protesters have taken more risks and pushed harder than King. Some also say that King didn't do much for women's rights. There's no doubt that he convinced the African American people to speak up and never wavered on preaching his dream of equality. This is evidence that was resonated with people then as well as people today. From the counter protests and sit-ins that took place back in the 60s to the outcry of injustices that you hear about today. The blacks are not silent today as they once were. In his King biography and interview, Taylor Branch talks about the paradox of King's doctrine of nonviolence. He said that it is rarely studied or taught, yet it is seen all around the world in political upheavals, such as the nonviolence beginnings that took place back during the toppling of the Berlin Wall, to the nonviolent side of the hands up, don't shoot groups that we've seen recently in Ferguson, Missouri. Reverend Samuel Billy Kiles was a friend of Dr. King, and he was in the church when he delivered his last speech. He was also with him the day that he was assassinated. During an interview in 2008 with NPR celebrating the 40th anniversary of the mountaintop speech, Reverend Kiles shares a pretty interesting point in what he thinks about Dr. Martin Luther King today versus then, or society today versus then.
I don't even know how to process it's been 40 years. I take issue with those people who say, oh, it's worse now than it was then. The only reason you can say that is because you were not here then.
Novelist Alice Walker in 1972 wrote, "He was the one fearless person for whom we waited." King made his way into the history books as a civil rights leader, a hero, or a champion of equality by nonviolence actions. Dr. Martin Luther King has made a lasting impact on the United States. It is said his work resulted in an impact of seismic proportion. There have literally been hundreds of books and papers and articles written about Mr. King. In 1978, there was a King miniseries. There's been other movies, and recently as 2014, the movie Selma. In addition, there have been songs written about Mr. King. One of the most famous is a joint song about him and others that had been assassinated was Abraham, Martin, and John, written by Dion in 1968. His speeches and sermons are still studied today. November 2nd, 1983, President Ronald Reagan signed a bill creating a federal holiday to honor Dr. Martin King. The observation of that holiday began in 1986. Some people even put Dr. King in the same company of U.S. presidents. A quote, "With his single phrase, 'I have a dream,' Dr. King joined the ranks of Presidents Jefferson and President Lincoln in shaping America." There's even been articles that connect President Obama's achievements to becoming the first black president, in some part due to the 60s civil rights movement. President Obama himself has praised Dr. King on multiple occasions. As a bigger part of a project, a Texas University graduate student and associate professor teamed up, and they identified 730 streets, boulevard, and highways that have been named after Dr. King. In addition, there have been multiple schools, hospitals, libraries, and other buildings named after Dr. King in his honor. In 2011, President Obama signed a proclamation acknowledging the 25th anniversary of Dr. King's holiday. President Obama stated the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. devoted his life to the struggle for justice and equality, sowing seeds of hope for a day when all people might claim the riches of freedom and the security of justice. On October 16, 2011, a granite likeness of Dr. King was dedicated as a memorial in Washington, D.C., and is next to the Lincoln Memorial. While the equality he spent most of his life fighting for still does not exist, His efforts led to significant change and has inspired thousands more to keep his movement alive and to keep seeking the dream. In his dedication speech of the memorial, President Obama made it quite clear, at least in his opinion, the dream is still alive.
Thought I saw him walking up over the hill with Abraham and Martin and John.
I say to you today, my friend, so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream.